Went back, I said, why not, right? So I'm very honored and happy to be here with all of you, and hoping to have the possibility of maybe engaging in conversation, not just with our colleagues, but also with you.
Great.
Well, honestly, you're going to have to follow the Donatella style.
Okay, so I just want to start this by saying that, okay, this amazing conversation, hopefully amazing conversation between us and Preciado is part of our lecture series in digital media culture, which is called Digital Delights and Disturbances. This is the second edition. We already have a premiere last semester with people like Lessig. I mean, Lessig is a star, right? But he was in the Aula Magna, so like by far not the same crowd. So we are really happy that this is improving, and I owe a big thank to a lot of people who made this event possible. So faculty support, front office, maintenance, media lab with Brian and his team, the comm department, of course, because this is part of our comm department lecture series, and the students also who are here, and some of them are really putting so much effort in this because they are helping us to make this happen. And actually tonight we're gonna enjoy like some Paul's writing through the acting of Jacopo Olmontinori, who's there. Yeah, he's gonna read for us. So without further hesitation, I just want to say that this is just, we are kickstarting the new edition of Digital Delights and Disturbances, but this is the first talk, which is going to be followed by 3 more talks in November. And actually, you know, I happened to be in Venice for the Biennale, where Paul was curating the Taiwan pavilion, which is really amazing. So if you get the chance, please go see it, because it's still there until 25th of November. And Shuli Chang, the Taiwanese artist who did the pavilion, is going to be here with us on the 26th. So after she wraps up with the exhibition in Venice, she's going to come here. So make sure you're here. And she's also part of the Digital Delights and Disturbances. Audrey Tang, the Minister of Digital of Taiwan, is also coming. You will see through telepresence on the 14th of October, so November, as a telepresence. Yeah, that's not unveiled. Yeah, telepresence, whatever. And last but not least, we have Antonia Hernandez, who is a young scholar from Canada, and she's going to talk about laboring on chaturbate. So again, it's something about concerning sexualities, identities, and the digital. So this is like, I think, a very good panel that we put together, lecture series. So make sure you're here in November, and you follow up also. I know Paul is a star, but please come to the other talks as well. They are good speakers. All right, so I think I'm gonna pass this to Professor Sarah.
Okay, hi, thanks Rosella, thanks Paul for being here, of course. And I'll start with the easy questions. Since we're starting from the beginning, we might as well really start from the beginning. So if you can talk about how you arrived to theory, to the work that you did, all of your activities as this public intellectual, this artist, curator, writer, activist, something, you know, what path you followed in doing this?
Well, it could be many answers to the question, from the short one to the long one. I will give like a middle one, I would say. First, because this might speak to some of the people that are here. I was born in the north of Spain, in a very Catholic environment, in a quite small city, and therefore in a context where there was absolutely not any, really I can say, any kind of feminist or lesbian or queer culture that I could get connected to. So for me, I think that all my history has been related or linked to exile, to really leaving certain things, and breaking up of things, and rupture, and losing things, and leaving things behind, as a possibility of inventing freedom. This is I think it's crucial for my life, and the more, of course, I was not conscious of that when I did it, I have to say, basically, super young, so I didn't think, oh, well, I'm going to invent my freedom and therefore I'm living it. That is not at all. But I felt that that my life as the connection, my own connection to life, and to creativity, to sexuality, to everything that I could be, was in danger if I was taken. So, but I actually, I'm telling you like pretty, let's say, intimate thing, because I haven't spoken about this, but since we are like a kind of intimate community of Caribbean, actually my parents something that was more like becoming a daughter or something. So basically I went to Madrid to kind of to run for the competition of young philosophy, basically. And I was 17, and then you had to prepare a text and read it in front of people and everything. So I had no idea philosophy whatsoever. But I did actually. I put up together something on William O'Boken, and I went to this prize and I won it. And then I could study philosophy in Madrid. But to my surprise, Madrid, are you filming me, by the way? Could you not? Yes. I would ask you not to film the event, if you don't mind. Well, when I went to Madrid, I realized that the situation was not very different to what I had known in the north of Spain and in Burgos, in this small city. That the university was equally conservative. The university was also very few women, even though now I can speak about that differently, but at the time, very few women were teaching within the departments of philosophy, let alone teaching something that had to do with the history of feminism or the history of so-called anti-colonial struggles. So I felt there is nothing for me there. And again, I had to start like a new exile. So I left Spain and I asked for a Fulbright, and I went to the US. And I had the chance of getting to the new school for social research in New York in the very early 90s, which I didn't know. Is basically, sometimes you do not realize what's happening when something is really happening, right? So at that time was the beginning, the actual beginning and the entering, the inscription of queer theory within the university and the academic world. But this was happening really in front of me when I was just a student. So basically I would go, I would enter into the Department of Philosophy. I wanted to do some kind of feminist studies. So I signed for a course on women's studies. But the problem is that a month later, women's studies was called gender studies. And 2 months later, gender studies had broken up and it was like into 100 pieces and had transformed into queer studies, black studies, Chicana studies, and we were like, okay, so what's going on, right? So the disciplines were like going through a very interesting undoing of the hegemonic discourses, and I was just in the middle of it at the same time, like I guess having a lot of fun in New York and not having fun also because New York is a very difficult city, and so but at the same time I was also engaging with activism at that time within the anti-AIDS struggles in New York, very much within the BDSM movement as well, because as we were speaking about this before, the discourses that kind of developed in the 90s in the US especially around gender didn't talk too much about sexuality. Sexuality was a little bit out of the film. So all discussions were like concerning gender, and mostly when we were saying gender, people were thinking about women, right? Like basically, of course then queer studies came, but still, even queer studies were not sexualized enough. because this was the moment of the AIDS crisis in New York and in the US and in Europe. So it was like not so good to talk about sex at the university or in society in general, right? So I guess that I went into the BDSM community at that time because I thought that that was a place where we could talk about sexuality differently, in a much more like a conceptual way, or just like an art way, or just like thinking about experimental practices. And so I was doing that. I was basically, I would spend the mornings in the university like with these chaos of disciplines, and I would go in the afternoons and evenings to the BDSM clubs and the meetings of AIDS activists. And also I think this was quite crucial to me. I guess that, well, maybe two things were very crucial. One, that I was a student of Derrida, and basically I would follow Derrida almost everywhere. So being Derrida at the same time, quite inspiring for the feminist movement at that time, but not really a feminist sense of it. Let's put it blindly. I mean, it's like the reality. And I mean, not knowing exactly for him what feminists could do. Still, now that I look back into this time, I realize that many of the things that Derrida allowed to happen, at least within philosophy, were precisely because he was taking many of the issues that were discussed within the feminist movement and kind of giving them a philosophical form, right? So his connection with feminism was there, even though he was not like fully explicit in his thought. And so I was, yeah, following Derrida and then following a lot of black feminists at that time. For instance, I was a student of Jackie Alexander, that maybe now is not so well known, and then I became a student of Toni Morrison as well. So, and these, I guess that these radical voices that were very much outside of the mainstream feminism were super important to me. Like basically that was the moment in which I realized that being a feminist was not enough, and I started to kind of drift a little bit, like not away, but even like I would say like deeper, or like in a much more complex way, in a series of becomings within feminism. Right? And this was very much triggered by, I guess, both the anti-AIDS movement and the black feminists that I was like surrounded by at that time.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you got from Derrida, apart from following him around? How he contributed to your own work also as well?
Well, it is still very influential to me, even until now, I have to say. I don't quote Derrida at every page, even though, for instance, if you read the manifesto, the counter-sexual manifesto, some people might think like, hello, I mean, is this a book about dildos? But what are we doing here, like speaking about Derrida? I mean, what is this thing, right? So this gives you like the exact picture of what was my life at that time. You know, like basically like how to connect two worlds that were not connected yet. And I guess that, I mean, I don't know if the crowd, if you that are there, like, if you are coming from philosophy or from critical theory or from activism, but what Derrida was trying to do with what it was called at that time, and is still called today, deconstruction, was really like a critique of the binary reason in reality, and a critique of metaphysics as being based constitutively, in a kind of a constitutive manner, on a series of binaries that organize social and political oppressions, whatever they are, like the living and the non-living, the animal and the human, the female and the male. Even in the case of Derrida, because he was himself Jewish from Algeria, and felt very much as a foreign within French philosophy himself. This is one of the reasons why he as well kind of went into exile and kind of left France and became much more known outside than in France in reality, right? So this notion of being foreign and that it is from the point of view of the foreign that the way in which hegemonic discourse has been constructed can be unveiled. This is it was absolutely crucial for my thought and for everything that I will do after. And I guess that in a sense you could say that like for instance Derrida inspired himself by the politics of difference of feminist thought to be able to do this critique of metaphysics, and myself and other people, we inspire ourselves on this critique of metaphysics to take it even farther and fully explore the binary, right? Because within the thought of Derrida, there is a kind of playful coming back to this, a critique of this binary, but a kind of playful coming back. It's kind of an entanglement. You can never get outside of these binaries in the thought of Derrida. Whereas basically, because his thought somehow is not fully, it doesn't develop fully within a kind of a political thinking, right? But some of us, and I'm speaking, of course, like people like Judith Butler that are also did like a lot of reading of Derrida, maybe different reading than myself, but a lot of reading of Derrida, and or me or other people from my generation. I think that we fully politicize again this critique of the metaphysics of presence and of the binary. And we are really thinking not just about deconstructing the binary, but about fully developing a new epistemology that doesn't need the binary to be able to represent or to produce or perform reality. I don't know if that was so clear. I mean, you have to, I'm curious, and you have to allow me like certain, a little bit of wondering, because basically I don't know exactly if you're coming from critical theory, from philosophy, from history of sexuality, from activism, from art. So hopefully some of these things that I'm saying will speak to different parties in the audience.
I think that was quite clear. You mentioned the Countersexual Manifesto. So this is one of your early works that you wrote early on. First of all, I just had this quote that you wrote for the preface of the new edition. It doesn't start with a call for revolution, but with the realization that we are the revolution that is already taking place. I think that's, it's one of those things that that just explodes the mind. But
maybe I can say something just to that. Is that I belong to a generation because I was very much trained by the feminists from the 1970s, and I think that all my background and knowledge is being formed by this feminism. We were always hearing them talking about the feminist revolution as something that it was in the past, right? Like, oh, it was this revolution that happened in the 70s and it was quite amazing and da-da-da. And then, of course, like, oh, horrifying, AIDS came, and well, the whole like kind of neoliberal development after the 70s and 80s, and that's it. Now we're living in a kind of a dark, boring time and everything. And then I realized that it's not true, absolutely not true, right? That the worst that could happen to us is like think that the revolution, either the feminist revolution or the sexual revolution or the epistemological revolution that we're living through, thinking that is in the past or maybe is to come, like in the future. And then it's like, oh, one day the revolution will come, I don't know, right? But I realized through my own experience, both in academia and of course, in activism, but then in the art as well, that maybe we'll come to speak about art, I realized that we were actually living through this revolution, and that even our bodies, our practices, the way we were like undoing discourse, inventing new grammars, was absolutely the revolution in the making. But it's just like one of the devices of the neoliberal, let's say, hookup on minds and bodies has to do precisely with this sense of nothing is happening, this sense of basically of impossibility. the sense that nothing can be done about it. Right? It's a little bit like with the ecological crisis or with questions of extinction. It's like, well, yeah, this is horrifying, it's really working very bad, but, you know, whatever, you know, let's continue, yeah. So it's a little bit, I mean, maybe we will come back to this with when we speak about Testo Junkie, but the issue of addiction, for me, addiction is one of the main modes in which technologies of power are connected to the production of contemporary subjectivities. And this is one of the reasons why we think that nothing is happening, right? Because we want more of this horrifying thing that is happening to us. We want more capitalism, more ecological destruction. So basically, like, the sense that this revolution was not possible. Right? And on the contrary, I realized precisely just looking around me and what was happening with the anti-colonial movements, the indigenous movements, what was happening within the media technologies. I was like, well, no, hello, this is the revolution is here and it's us. It's like we are living through it. I have to tell you that I don't see you anymore. Now you just disappeared on the...
Since you mentioned Testo Junkie, I think at this point we can sort of talk a little bit about Testo Junkie and have Jacobo read a little section of that. Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Okay. 3. Testogel. A few months before your death, Dell, my master gender hacker, gives me a box of 30 packets of 50 milligram testosterone in gel form. I keep them in a glass box for a long time, as if they were dissected scarabs, poisoned bullets extracted from a corpse, fetuses of an unknown species, vampire teeth capable of flying at your throat just for you having looked at them. During this period, I spend my time with my trans friends. Some are taking hormones as part of a protocol to change sex, and others are fooling with it, self-medicating without trying to change their gender legally or going through any psychiatric follow-up. They don't identify with the term gender dysphorics and declare themselves gender pirates or gender hackers. I belong to this latter group of testosterone users. We are copyleft users who consider sex hormones free and open biocodes, whose use shouldn't be regulated by the state or commandeered by pharmaceutical companies. When I decide to take my first dose of testosterone, I don't talk about it to anyone. As if it were a hard drug, I wait until I'm alone in my home to try it. I wait for nightfall. I take a packet out of the glass box, which I close immediately to be sure that today, for my first time, I'll take one and only one dose. I've barely started, yet I'm already behaving as if I were an addict of an illegal substance. I hide, keep an eye on myself, censor myself, exercise restraint. The following evening, almost at the same time, I take a second 50 milligram dose. On the third day, the third dose. During these days and nights, I'm writing the text that will go through Dell's last book of photos. I don't speak to anyone, just write. As if writing were the only accurate witness of this process. All the others are going to betray me. I know they're going to judge me for having taken testosterone. Some because I'm going to become a man among men, because I was doing well as a girl. Others because I took testosterone outside the aegis of a medical protocol, without wanting to become a man, because I used testosterone like a hard drug, like any other, and gave bad press to testosterone at the very moment when the law is beginning to integrate transsexuals into society, to guarantee reimbursement from the state health service for the drugs and operations. Writing is the place where my secret addiction resides, at the same time as the stage on which my addiction seals a pact with a multitude. On the fourth night, no sleep. I'm lucid, energetic, wide awake, like I was the first night I had sex with a girl when I was a kid. At 4 in the morning, I'm still writing without the slightest sign of fatigue. Sitting in front of the computer, I feel the muscles of my back innervated by a cybernetic cable that starts at the surface of the city and grows in length, passing through my skull to connect with the planets most distant from Earth. At 6 in the morning, after 10 hours of not moving from my chair, of drinking only water, I get up and go out with my dog, Justine, for a walk in the city. It's the first time I leave my home at 6 in the morning without a precise destination on an autumn day. The bulldog is puzzled. She doesn't like to go out so early, but she follows. I need to breathe the air of the city, to leave the space of domesticity, to walk outside where I feel at home. I walk down Rue de Belleville to the Chinese market. The African garbage collectors are building dikes, willow rugs to change the course of the sewage. I wait for Le Folie Bar to open, have a coffee, wolf down 2 croissants, and return up the street. When I get home, I'm sweating. I notice my sweat has changed. I collapse onto the couch and watch Télé, the news only, and for the first time in 3 days, I fall into a deep sleep, drenched in the testosterone sweat, next to Justine.
Thank you so much for the reading, thanks. Actually, they asked me if I could read something, and I said that I'm the worst reader, either of my own stuff or someone else. That's a great thing.
It's not true that he's the worst reader, but anyway, I think this was amazing, Jacopo. Thank you so much. It was like deeply emotional, really. We're gonna have more. But yeah, so we wanted this like an introduction to your work, Testo Junkie, which was, I think, I mean, at least for me, the dream of every academic to write such a book, which is not boring at all. It's not like our academic books, right? When you write an academic book, you try to hide it. Oh, it's an academic book, how boring. But your work is mind-blowing, not just because it's a weird, amazing, innovative combination of theory, because, I mean, we are talking about a work, guys, that talks about philosophy, no shit, you know? Foucault, Derrida, I mean, you need to read these theories if you want to understand Testo Junkie, I mean, besides the personal part. However, the theory part really melts it in such an elegant way with the biography of Paul, autobiography, something in sociology we will call autoethnography. This is something actually also I try to do when I teach my selfie class, to tell the students, hey, we should do autoethnography. And I actually was inspired by your book. Because I think that in order to look at us as subjects who are involved in this, well, pharmacopornographic era, as you will tell in the text, we need to be at the center of the analysis. We can no longer, you know, have this detachment, which is what critical theory taught us, right, to do. But maybe a combination of both, like having a critical theory, distance from the subject, but also being aware that we are the subjects would help. And so I think you did an amazing job, and I mean, I don't know where to start, but maybe I would like you to talk a little bit about the process of producing this book, which you call a body essay. So it's even the definition is kind of like totally new.
Well, actually, I do not consider this work to be academic. I dislike these differences that we establish between academic and non-academic thinking. And I also dislike the idea that academic books are boring, or that this doesn't speak to me as well. Probably because I've always been interested in things that are boring. And so sometimes when people tell me like, oh, this book is very boring, I'm like, well, it might be interesting to me. And so no, I know, and for me it's not either a book, an autobiographical book. Actually the book, I started with the death of a friend. My editor in France and a very good friend, Guillaume Duston, who was also a writer, a very important writer for some of us, because was one of the first ones in France that openly spoke about being HIV positive and having sex at the same time and not becoming an object of medical discourse, even though he was sick. Because the issue is that, of course, you can be HIV positive, but then you have to behave. You have to, once you're HIV positive, you have to just like stop sex and be, you know, like you become like the good patient, right? And he was like all but that. He really like started to speak openly about having sex, being HIV positive, and going out and party with people and so on. So for me, it was very important to basically get connected to him, and he was the person that published the Counter-Sexual Manifesto. Maybe might be a link between the two books. Basically, when I wrote the Counter-Sexual Manifesto, I never wrote this book as a book to be published, never. For me, it was like a dream. It was like a comic that I did for. At that time, I was completely, as I was told you, like as I told you before, like within the BDSM community. So we were like writing contracts all the time. I was writing contracts with my friends to have sex and da da da. So I thought like, oh well, I'm gonna write contracts, but with my philosophical language because that's what I know how to do, right? And I had some friends that were very much into theory, so we had a lot of fun by basically like re-sexualizing this language, and found it like very sexy, like the whole philosophy, yeah, like hardcore thing. So that's how the book really started, like through writing these contracts, and then with the idea that we were starting like having sex with each other, a sex that cannot be fully defined as male or female, heterosexual, homosexual. It was something else, completely something else, and it was not just like sadomasochist or whatever, that's bullshit. It was just like fully experimental. We were inventing a different kind of pleasure by being together and doing all these things, right? So in a sense, you can say that it was a little bit like taking experimental art and conceptual art within the sex communities and the sexual practices, right? So that was the way we were doing it. And then, I had these contracts and everything, and I met Guillaume Duston in France, and I started like going out with him at night and doing contracts with him and everything. And one day I said like, well, you know, I have also these contracts that maybe we can do something with it. And he was an editor at that time, and he said like, he immediately called me back and he said like, this is the first time that I read a philosophy book and I can jerk off at the same time, you know? And I thought like, well, I don't know, I didn't think about that. And then he said to me, and I want to publish it. And basically like a month later, we were like already like publishing this book. And I was like unconscious, completely unconscious of what this could be. So when it came out in France, people didn't even know what to do with it. It was like absurd. And then I took it to Derrida, who was still alive at that time, and I said, hey, Jackie, what do you think about this? And he said like, oh, this is great, it's like super fun and everything, but please don't tell anyone that I read it. I said like, I promise I won't say anything. And then what happened is that that Guillaume was the object of a lot of criticism with the gay community because he was very open about his sexuality being HIV positive. And this criticism and the amount of harassment that he had in the gay community was so strong that he committed suicide. This is the reality of it. It is the reality of the amount of pressure that we put on ourselves. Already being a minority that is under a lot of violence, we still have to add some more. And I think that this is also my experience very much sometimes within the feminist movement, the gay and lesbian movement and the trans movement, and this is why I'm now in the last book, in the An Apartment on Uranus, I'm very much advocating against identity. I can't take it anymore. I can't take these identities anymore. They're killing us. And we are killing each other with them. With the presumption that we know what is to be a woman, that we know what feminism has to be, that we know that what a gay identity should be, and so on and so forth. The same with the trans identity now and all the discussions. So basically what happened at the end is that Guillaume killed himself. And this was like a bomb to all of us, and especially to me. I had conversations with him, and I always thought he was joking, and but no, it was the truth that he was a public person in France, and under a lot of pressure. And this was so strong that that I decided to basically to get into an exercise or a contract, almost you can put it that way. I signed a contract with myself instead of signing a contract with someone else. I'm gonna sign a contract with myself. I'm gonna go through an exercise which will be intentionally producing my subjectivity differently. And it was, at that point, was many different things. It was, of course, like bringing him alive in my own body. So there is a lot of techno-shamanism, there is a lot of witchcraft, there is but queer witchcraft, the sensation that he could live through me if I would become something close to him, which is not. Right? So I started this, in a sense, that's exactly what I did. I signed a contract with myself and I said, okay, during 9 months, I will take testosterone and I will intentionally go through what this would be without knowing exactly what it would be, because I didn't want to sign a contract with. I mean, this is what is interesting. When you are, if you want to take testosterone now within our binary, gender, sexual binary society and epistemology, you have to identify as gender dysphoric, and then you have to sign a contract with the state. You sign a contract with the state, with the medical and the juridical system to get the right to basically have testosterone be given to you as a therapy to a pathology, right? So that's a model. And what I decided to do is basically to engage into a counter model of that, to create a counter narrative, a counter discourse to the one that is proposed by medical discourse and by the law. And so I started taking testosterone outside of the protocol of sex change, and writing was crucial to that, because for me was through writing and by making public that exercise of taking testosterone through writing that I could engage in a kind of counter power technology. Right? So basically, so it's not, as you can see in Testo Junkie is not a coming out book. So that's why for me it's not autobiographical. It is not about me. It has nothing to do. I don't care about me. It's not about me. And it's not about me discovering that I'm trans and saying oh, how much trans I am. I was always trans, my mother already knew, and I don't know how to tell them, and now what am I going to do, and da-da-da-da. No, this is, I mean, this kind of narrative, this is basically the mainstream medical, legal narrative that considers that there is this framework of male and female gender, and then of homosexual and heterosexual sexuality, and that will provide with a narrative for you to go from one to the other, right? But this was not the case for me. So in my case, what I wanted to do was really like a counter narrative to that, and using writing to kind of unravel this process of becoming something else, which for me was not going from being female into being male, but opening up the possibility of inventing other practices of freedom, inventing other subjective modalities, right? And of course, the limitation of that is that as you can see, and now I'm in front of you now, this is a bodily process, right? So that's why it's a bodily essay in the sense that it is a critical, for me, it's a critical epistemic exercise, but at the same time, one of the elements of this essay is embodiment, right? So it entails the transformation of my own body, up to the point that, of course, like my voice is changing, my face is changing, and then it's a moment in which basically I'm like, oh, hello, okay, now I look like a guy, so what am I gonna do? Yeah, okay, fine. And then I start playing with it because I think that as a contemporary philosopher, probably I cannot imagine, and there might be other experiences that are interesting and you have to figure out on finding them, but at least for me, I cannot imagine a most interesting position than the one that I'm living through. Basically, embodying this physical living fiction of being apparently a man in a patriarchal society, in a techno-patriarchal society, within a binary system, a gender binary and sexual binary system, but it's still with a feminist, a radical feminist consciousness. So that's a kind of a, like a split of the self that, of course, can take many modalities. That sometimes takes the modality of inquiry, of self-ethnography, as you were saying. Other times takes the modality of pleasure because you enjoy that transgression, and other times it's just like horrifying because you're like, what's this? This is the worst that I imagine. I mean, like becoming a man in a kind of a techno-patriarchal society, in a regime of the binary. Actually, I have to say that maybe it's because of the context, maybe it's because of the questions, maybe it's because I don't see you, but I have to say that this is really becoming very intimate because I'm saying things that I never said before in public. So.
Thank God it was sunny today, so we got the courtyard. I think you know that the name we are given to this conversation is hacking the binary, and actually not by chance. And you've been mentioning Derrida and this binary issue, and now you talk about bodily essay that is Testo Junkie as an exercise in disrupting this binary logic. And I would say that, of course, your work, I mean, Testo Junkie precisely does it in the content, of course, because it precisely deals with what you have been talking about, but also in the form. It's a very revolutionary text because in the form itself, like it hacks all the protocols, let's say, of academic writing, theoretical, philosophical discourse, medical discourse. So it's just a very fine operation of hacking into the genres also of writing. So it's not just the content itself of the essay, but the form, which is kind of like producing this kind of liberation effect. And this is why I started by saying this is the dream of every academic. Not because academia is boring, but I mean...
Then what I would say is that if it's... but if it's the dream, I think that... I think that this is very much related to the academia, because I think the academia is big trouble. It's big, because in academia you are in a position in which you pretend that you're very critical, or we pretend that we're very critical, but we fully stand on the position of power, right? So in reality, there are very few things that can be done from that position. So better to assume that position and start like seeing what we can do with it, right? And I say this because if you like, for instance, if there is something that is touching you when you read Testo Junkie, why don't you do the same with your own subjectivity otherwise? Because either, I mean, when you say that the kind of theory that you do in academia is boring, what I would say is that the life we live in academia is boring. It's not the theory. It is not the theory that is boring. It's the life that we live that is boring, right? So it's the life. It's life that has to be transformed, right? And then this will immediately provoke changes in the way you write. So instead of immediately running and saying, oh, this is autobiographical, I have to put myself in it, I have to, or maybe, you know, this is not so interesting. The question is like, what is important to you? Always when I was still at the university and I had like my students that would come to ask me like, oh, I don't know if I want to do a PhD, engage in like for so long on a research. And normally I ask them like, what are you interested in? Like, what do you want to do? And they are like, I don't know, I want to do a PhD. And for me, that would be like, it's a little bit like when you say like, yeah, I want to be in love, but I don't like anyone, you know? It's like, it's not interesting. It's like basically having sex with someone that is not exciting to you. It's the same. So the question is like, what is being mobilized within your life that can kind of penetrate, end up penetrating the kind of critical work that you do, right? For me, that's the I think that's the issue, or the way that I relate to academic thinking. And then in the case of Testo Junkie, then there is like the other direction of things. For instance, when I started writing on the Testo Junkie as this protocol of self-intoxication with testosterone and so on, then I decided that I wanted to do a political genealogy of hormones, to be able to know exactly what I was taking, right? Like to get to understand what are the technologies that will be constituting me through the relationship with testosterone, right? So, and this, by the way, again, is very much coming from AIDS, because this is coming from the AIDS politics of the late 80s and the 90s, when the patients, they start criticizing the medical system by saying we need to know what are the molecules that we are taking. We need to know, because otherwise we will die. So they start becoming experts, and for me it's very interesting that all the AIDS crises kind of provoke the appearance of a new type of both discourse but also of activism that is not very much related to identity, if you think about it. The question of being HIV positive is not so much about the identity, but it's much more about practices. What do you do with whom in relation to what exactly? How can you continue being alive? What are the substances that you have to be providing to your body in order for it to continue living, right? So, and of course, this was also one of the first situations within the 20th century in which you would find, let's say, gay people, drug users, sex workers, migrants, you know, different types of people that were not connected through identity, but were connected through the relationship they had to the medical industry, to the pharmacological industry, because they were using a certain type of drug, right? So in the case of Testo Junkie, I was very much influenced by that. And then I decided, okay, I really want to do like my fellow friends with HIV drugs. They decided to do something that they called at the time opening the pill. Really opening up the pill that they were taking and understanding what were the technologies that were constituting them, killing them, or making them alive. And I had transformed a little bit like this anecdote of opening up a pill into a philosophical, critical tool. I decided to open the pill. And I think that this can be extended to any kind of technology that we are in relation to. Our relationship to technology is not just either one of we are being used by technology or we use it, but we might have this relationship of opening up the pill, right? And I started to do it with testosterone and with hormones. At the beginning, I was very interested in knowing more about testosterone. What were the the pharmacological industries that were producing it, how was it being fabricated, commercialized, the whole thing. But then I realized, going into libraries, and I was doing this research in New York, where you have like at NYU you have a huge library where you can actually access the books freely, which I think is fantastic, by the way, but this is a different thing. Yeah? So that you don't have any frontier between you and the books. You can really see the books the way they are organized. So I went there looking for testosterone, and I found, let's say, more or less 4, 5, 6 books about testosterone within the medical industry. I thought, okay, hello, there's not a lot. But then I realized I just like moved my eyes to the back of it, and I was like, oh, wow. Then I saw like basically like 200 meters of books on estrogen and progesterone. And I thought, ooh, something's interesting here. And then I thought, well, since I'm already here, let's see, I'm gonna have a look to these books about progesterone and estrogen. And this is exactly how I got to do a lot of research on the pill, on the discovery of the pill, on the way the pill became the most and best sell substance of the whole history of the pharmacological industry. And I was pretty surprised because I thought, like, knowing and coming me from feminist and the feminist tradition, I couldn't understand why my teachers, my colleagues, my fellow activists from the feminist movement had not done that research on the pill. Like, all this discourse about the pill is like sexual freedom. It's like, well, I mean, maybe not. You know, like, have a look into it. Let's see what's happening, right? And this is how. So at the same time that I was working on this protocol on taking testosterone, I was doing this research on the hormones, and this is how I started to think that something crucial was happening in terms of the history of sexuality after the Second World War. That it was like really like a radical break, and that a whole new regime was being put together that had nothing to do with the description that Foucault had done of sexuality in the 19th century, right? And so that was like so, I had to say this was yes, it was a revelation. It came through days and nights of reading these books on the pill and estrogen, and a moment of yeah, like history, like talking to me, but almost like knocking me on the head, and I thought, like, wow, this is unbelievable. But yes, something is happening in around the 1940s, 1950s that has to do with certain elements that are crucial. First, the invention of the notion of gender, that is absolutely new, that didn't exist before, and that has nothing to do with the notion of sex. Sex was supposed to be anatomic, fixed, given to you from the beginning of your life up to your death, and that's it, right? No discussion. And then suddenly you have like a bunch of doctors, mostly working with what they called at that time intersex babies, that will develop this notion of gender to talk about the possibility of modulating bodies and modulating subjectivity in order to produce either femininity or masculinity, right? And this is the moment in which basically I came to the realization that an extraordinary epistemological crisis is taking place in the 1940s, and one that is still with us today. We have not overcome this crisis. The whole medical system in the 1940s, they realized that the epistemology, meaning this regime of representation of the sexual binary, is not working. They realized that there are bodies, in terms of chromosomes, in terms of genetics, in terms of morphology, the body form, in terms of endocrinology, the hormones of the bodies, that exceed, that go beyond, that cannot be reduced to the binary. But instead of modifying the sex epistemology of the binary, they decide to actually intervene within the bodies and modify, intentionally modify the bodies of the what they will call intersex babies. Right? And this is such a it's such an important moment, a moment in which basically the binary epistemology crystallizes in an even more violent way than it was before. And I guess that, of course, like everything that is going to happen after the 50s and 60s, in both directions, in the direction of an enormous normalization of the gender binary on one side, if you think about the medical discourse, but at the same time as well, in terms of also a very strong political transformation and critique of this binary and the invention of new bodies, new pleasures, new social positions that cannot be reduced to just female or male, right? So this was like that entailed a lot of research, if you want to put it this way. If you want to, so it was doing a lot of research, but it was not. I didn't do it in a very academic way because for me it was like, I don't know. I was going nuts. I was like basically like almost on a crime store, basically like discovering things and trying to keep up with the writing and so on. So that's the way I, and of course since it was very important as well, the relationship with the pharmacological industry, and on the other side, the invention of pornography. This is, maybe for some of you, this is like not very easy to understand, but if you think about the regime, the disciplinary regime of sexuality within the 19th century, the one that invented the differences between heterosexuality and homosexuality, everything depended on the continuity between heterosexuality and reproduction, right? And therefore, like, basically, in order for the family to be reproductive, in order for the nation to produce enough working force, enough bodies that at the same time work and consume, right? So there is all this reproductive logic that has to work with this connection between heterosexuality and reproduction. I mean, this is, I cannot even believe how this can be a secret. This has always been like one of the central topics of feminism since the 19th century. Nevertheless, we have, I mean, we, when I say we, I'm talking here about like the sexual minorities. We have been going through some kind of confusion and problems like dealing with our own relationship to these reproductive techniques, because we have spent the last 50 years, instead of fighting those, let's say, reproductive techniques imposed from the nation state, we have been fighting, or part of the movement, the gay and lesbian movement, has been fighting for integrating the homosexuals within the heterosexual society and make them equally productive for the system. Like basically, like if you think about the way the movement has worked in the last 50 years, it's just unbelievable. I mean, I think that it's almost impossible to, if we think about the radicality of this movement, both in the 1920s, but later in the 1970s as well. If you think that the aims that the movement has given to itself are basically mostly marriage, gay marriage, and adoption and reproduction for gay couples. This is just, right, so in a sense, is the, yeah, I mean, if you want to plot just as a way of saying that you are there, I because I don't see you, so you're so quiet that I don't know anymore if there is someone there or not. But yes, and this is a question for all of us, and for me again, this is a critique of identity. We need to start like looking about the way in which our own minority movements have shaped themselves within the model of identity politics up to the point of fully becoming part of the technologies of power that we were fighting against, right? And now basically, through the last 50 years, we have become more women, more gay, more lesbian, more, well, lesbians maybe I leave them in a bracket, because lesbians are like so witchy and ruling that it's very difficult, and top, this is the hope, there is hope. But apart from the lesbians, so yeah, more female, more women, more gay, and now more trans, and da, da, da. But my question is, if we have produced more identity or more freedom, and in my opinion, we have produced a lot of identity and very little freedom, right? So my last book that is not translated in Italian yet, but it will be like thanks to Fandango, that is my fantastic editor, and I like to say something about Fandango because they are, I mean, without these editors that basically take the risk of publishing people like me, I mean, what would we do? You know, it would be nothing. So thank you, Fandango, for existing.
But you're not a boring academic, so they are taking half of the risk. It's pretty clear.
No, but I mean, you know, at the beginning, I have to say that when they decided to publish the first book, I can say that they took a lot of risk because no one was really reading it, right? But yeah, I mean, in the last book, An Apartment on Uranus, the big question for me is if we could move from these politics of identities and the logic of identity for organizing our movement and start thinking collectively about a radical transformation of the gender epistemology and how to invent collectively other practices of freedom instead of just like asking for more family, asking for more reproduction, or for more identity.
Actually, just because you mentioned Fandango, I want to remind that after the talk, there are books over there, and Paul is gonna stay for a while, like signing the books, and yeah.
I will not sign a lot, but I can sign some
of them. Right. Okay, so this was great. I mean, what I got from you is make academia great again, or make academia sexy again. I hope that you succeeded in convincing our students also to do more research, because this is actually our not so hidden aim. You know.
The thing is that I think that we need a revolution within the university, and I think that
you agree?
Yeah, I think that yes, we need a revolution within the university, and that some of the disciplines that we are still promoting, in a sense that when you come to the university, you want to get a title on whatever, you know, like political theory or philosophy, or and these disciplines, again, they really belong in a sense to these technologies of power that we're trying to curriculum and do all of us together, right? So maybe, and especially if we think about like private universities or universities in which you have to invest a lot of money to be able to access knowledge, right? So I think that the university of the future will not have teachers the way we know them now, and it will have like probably like collective exercises, right? Like the one that I proposed in the Stojonki, but maybe collectively done. And one of the reasons why I left the university and I moved into a kind of uncharted region between the arts, the university, and activism is precisely because of that, because of my insatisfaction or dissatisfaction by going to places like NYU or Princeton and teaching radical critical theory to people that have to pay 30,000 euros to come and take my classes. So I thought, no, this is impossible. And so yeah, I think that we have to collectively organize the places where we can produce the knowledge that we are living with. Because I think that the interesting thing about the university is that it has the power to legitimize knowledge, right? So it produces not just knowledge but value, right? It is basically giving value. That's why you come to get a title, to basically add some value to your life, right? So ideally, I would actually love to create collectively a different kind of school. A school that will not be for a certain period of time. You will not make differences between ages, that you don't have to go there to get a title, but you go there to just like become more sophisticated in producing the critical tools that you need to basically open the pill, right? So, a revolutionary school.
And actually, in the end, you got there also because of Derrida and also because your experience, yeah. So this is to say also that we do need critical theory, I'm afraid. We do need it.
Critical theory, absolutely. I'm totally,
good, we are in
absolutely. The thing is like, I agree. The only difference, for instance, is that, it's the question of what are the institutions, exactly. It's not critical theory. Critical theory is great, but are the institutions that kind of appropriate those critical tools and label them and give value to them, right? And in the case of Derrida that I follow, yes, it's true, but for instance, in the US, it was extremely expensive to follow the classes of Derrida, and it was like a question of hierarchy and whatever. And then you would go to France, and it was like completely, it was free for everyone. And you will have like 200 people coming to the classes every day, and Derrida will give exactly the same class and do exactly the same thing. And yeah, and I guess he was one of the most generous people that I know as a teacher. Right? So that's just to say.
Okay, so because I think, like you just mentioned, critical theory, I would like to call Jacob again because we selected.
How are we going in terms of time?
You tell us when you want to stop.
No, I think that let's ask Giacomo maybe because he prepared for it. So it's a good thing. Yes.
Yeah, because also we would like to show you how Paul also writes about critical concepts, you know, and so we selected an excerpt from Testo Genchi.
We are being confronted with a new kind of hot, psychotropic punk capitalism. Such recent transformations are imposing an ensemble of new microprosthetic mechanisms of control of subjectivity by means of biomolecular and multimedia technical protocols. Our world economy is dependent on the production and circulation of hundreds of tons of synthetic steroids and technically transformed organs, fluids, cells, technoblood, technosperm, technoovum, etc., on the global diffusion of a flood of pornographic images, on the elaboration and distribution of new varieties of legal and illegal synthetic psychotropic drugs. For example, bromazepam, Special K, Viagra, speed, crystal, Prozac, ecstasy, poppers, heroin. On the flood of signs and circuits of the digital transmission of information. On the extension of a form of diffuse urban architecture to the entire planet in which megacities of misery are knotted into high concentrations of sex capital. These are just some snapshots of a post-industrial, global, and mediatic regime that from here on I will call pharmacopornographic. The term refers to the processes of a biomolecular, pharmaco, and semiotic technical, pornographic, government of sexual subjectivity, of which the pill and Playboy are two paradigmatic offspring. Although their lines of force may be rooted in the scientific and colonial society of the 19th century, their economic vectors become visible only at the end of World War II. Hidden at first under the guise of a Fordist economy, they reveal themselves in the 1970s with the gradual collapse of this phenomenon. During the second half of the 20th century, the mechanisms of the pharmacopornographic regime are materialized in the fields of psychology, sexology, and endocrinology. If science has reached the hegemonic place that it occupies as a discourse and as a practice in our culture, it is because, as Ian Hacking, Steve Woogler, and Bruno Latour had noticed, it works as a material discursive apparatus of bodily production. Technoscience has established its material authority by transforming the concepts of the psyche, libido, consciousness, femininity and masculinity, heterosexuality and homosexuality, intersexuality and transsexuality into tangible realities. They are manifest in commercial chemical substances and molecules, biotype bodies, and fungible technological goods managed by multinationals. The success of contemporary technoscientific industry consists in transforming our depression into Prozac, our masculinity into testosterone, our erection into Viagra, our fertility or sterility into the pill, our AIDS into tritotherapy, without knowing which comes first, our depression or Prozac, Viagra or an erection, testosterone or masculinity, the pill or maternity, tritherapy or AIDS. This performative feedback is one of the mechanisms of the pharmacopornographic regime. Contemporary society is inhabited by toxic pornographic subjectivities. Subjectivities defined by the substance or substances that supply their metabolism, by the cybernetic prosthesis and various types of pharmacopornographic desires that feed the subject's action and through which they turn into agents. So we will speak of Prozac subjects, cannabis subjects, cocaine subjects, alcohol subjects, Ritalin subjects, cortisone subjects, silicone subjects, heterovaginal subjects, double penetration subjects, Viagra subjects, dollar subjects. There is nothing to discover in nature. There is no hidden secret. We live in a punk hypermodernity. It is no longer about discovering the hidden truth in nature. It is about the necessity to specify the cultural, political, and technological processes through which the body, as artifact, acquires natural status. The oncomouse, the laboratory mouse biotechnologically designed to carry a carcinogenic gene, eats Iyer. Buffy kills the vampire Simone de Beauvoir. The dildo, a synthetic extension of sex to produce a pleasure and identity, eats Rocco Siffredi's cock. There is nothing to discover in sex or in sexual identity. There is no inside. The truth about sex is not a disclosure. It is sex design. Pharmacopornographic biocapitalism does not produce things. It produces mobile ideas, living organs, symbols, desires, chemical reactions, and conditions of the soul. In biotechnology and in porno-communication, there is no object to be produced. The pharmacopornographic business is the invention of a subject and then its global reproduction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, because this is so difficult to read.
That was really amazing. I have to say also, this is like pretty crystal clear, the demonstration that you can write critical theory in an engaging way. I mean, in these very short excerpts that we just read, there is Foucault, there is Donna Haraway, there is the fundamental shift that you underline from the autonomist school like Virno and the others, like talking about capitalism as a process that produces immaterial goods and knowledge towards a capitalism that produces subjectivity. And I think I would like just to exercise my latest microphone authority to ask you this theoretical question, to talk a little bit about this shift that you identify in the book from this regime of biopower that Foucault talks about towards a new era that you identify as a pharmacopornographic, in which, for me, what I also took from your book is this idea or image of the shot. That for me, the shot, is something related to big pharma, because you take a shot of drugs. It's a shot also related to Hollywood, because of course when you shoot something, you have a good shot. And for me, because I come from a war zone, which is Syria, and my book is called A Shooting Revolution, and so this idea of shooting, it's also connecting to war, because like you shot, like you fire. And there is also something connecting to war and violence in your book, of course. So, I don't know, I throw a lot of ideas on the table, but I would love you to talk about this. How does the porno pharmacographic era, whatever, pharmacopornographic era looks like?
Why do I write like so difficult things to say, right? But I don't know, I guess that, sometimes, just to talk about critical theory, sometimes, the thing is that because people sometimes ask me like, why all this terminology, right? But I did need this terminology to be able to say what I wanted to say. It was not, I had to invent this new terminology because I wasn't able to do it otherwise. And of course, like even the issue of putting together pharmaco and porn, like basically using the word porn to think about the communication and media industry, of course, is a big taboo, because the porn is like the underlying energy and engine of this industry. So I wanted to really like bring it up fully. Like the same thing with pharmacology. Basically, instead of really saying science, I wanted to say, no, let's not say science, let's be clear, let's speak about the connection between science and capitalism, and this is the pharmacological industry, right? So that's why some of these, just to explain some of these notions and why I needed to basically bring them and make them visible in this way through some of this terminology. But to go back to the question of biopower and so on, well, of course, you can look at this Tojonki, but also what I'm done afterwards, or what I'm doing now, as trying to think a contemporary history of sexuality after Foucault, but trying to bring Foucault within the 21st century, and at the same time also being quite careful with Foucault as well, because Foucault, I mean, as someone that has been so influential with the history of sexuality, it's very compromising to use someone that first had no feminist culture whatsoever, didn't use the notion of gender, was probably like extremely reluctant to even, I'm not just saying feminist, but like to the history of women as a whole, basically. That he thought that the history of women would be the history of the uterus. It's like basically, hello, I mean, Michelle, wake up, So yeah, I mean, they need to somehow like take some of the, of course, extraordinary elements of the theory of Michel Foucault and his analysis of power, but at the same time bring them into also a critique of gender oppression, the anti-colonial question that Foucault, of course, again, I mean, come on, you're French, you're working on the 19th century archive, but you completely forgot that half of Africa has been colonized by the French, and that everything that you're talking about is not happening in Europe, it's happening somewhere else. So these questions from the beginning were quite troubling for me when reading Foucault and trying to use and kind of extend Foucault. But even more, when I started working on testosterone, on the history of the pill, on pornography, then I realized that, of course, Foucault had stopped his research first on the 19th century. Then he was like I think he was panicking in a sense of having to talk about the present time and having to say something about his own sexuality, being at the same time the writer of the history of sexuality and being gay, into the S&M movement, and and then of course HIV positive at the end and dying of AIDS and everything. So that he went not just into the 19th century and there he stopped. He even went all the way back to the Greek, like saying let's go as far as possible, basically let's go to bacteria, and there we will have to talk about myself and my identity and everything, right? So yeah, went back to the Greek. So right, but in a sense what I tried to do, or just like I found myself doing while writing Testo Junkie, was using some of these notions of Foucault, but trying to think with these notions contemporary power technologies, which are clearly not the technologies of the 19th century. I mean, they are so far away from the 19th century that I think that Foucault was extremely misleading in many respects. It's amazing that someone like Foucault barely talk about TV, for instance. It's completely unimaginable. I mean, even Bourdieu was more interested in kind of TV, but of course was a sociologist. For Foucault, TV was uninteresting. Basically, it's too popular culture to be interested in that. But yes, kind of just not paying attention to the main technology of the 50s by thinking that it's better to talk about techniques of saying the truth for the Greeks. Why not? But yeah. Apply those techniques to yourself and start talking, which would be better, right? So yeah, the thing is that just in a kind of a sketchy way, and this is very sketchy, but we don't have the time, but in a very sketchy way, and for some people that might not have this background on Foucault, on critical theory, much of the research that had been done by Foucault had to do with the relationship between architectures of power and the production of certain types of subjects within modernity. And these architectures of, these technologies of power were framed or shaped as collective architectures within the 19th century, and even from the 15th century on. These institutions were the domestic institution, the school, the factory, the psychiatric institution, the hospital, and so on and so forth, right? But all of them worked like exoskeletons, really as collective frames, shape and taking the form of architectures. And this is why for me it was also very important to actually, when you talk about critical theory, everything, part of my research was done within the Department of Architecture. And therefore, half of my background is also in the history of technologies. Technologies not in the Foucauldian sense, but in the Lewis Mumford sense, really technologies. Right? So I pay a lot of attention to the relationship between these collective technologies and the production of certain subjects. And then I realized that what was happening is that through the 40s and 50s, through the invention of new biotechnologies, the invention a little bit later of cybernetics and the internet, the invention of television and let's say cable communications and phone communications, that now this can look like, okay, they're always there or not. It's not the case. For instance, all the technologies of power that Foucault is talking about in the 19th century are phoneless. There is no phone. Okay, this can look to you stupid, but it's not. It's a subject is extremely formed, constituted, and fabricated by the technologies he, she, it is using, and these technologies contribute to the production of his subject. Right? So a subject without form, clearly, I mean, for instance, the heterosexual, homosexual subject of the 19th century is mostly a subject that it relates to others through writing, through the book, or through orality, but has no, let's say, technological mediation as we have now, no interface. No? And this is absolutely, I mean, this part of the work that you do, both of you, and it's absolutely crucial. Right? So, in my research, I kind of realized that part of the transformation of technologies of power during the 20th century had to do with the miniaturization, the scaling down of these technologies of power that were before collective architectures into microprosthetics, meaning both biosubstances that are crafted, that do not exist in nature, that are crafted, right, through biotechnology and transform into substance, and most particularly into an object that can have a design and that can be eaten, swallowed, and become part of the body. So this is, for me, this is why I call it the pill, the eatable panopticon, or the edible panopticon, because I realized that yes, what Foucault had called the panopticon as this structure of surveillance and definition of a space and time in the living of a subject, the same kind of mechanism will be working within the pill, but in a kind of biotechnological reduction of this power architecture. So in a sense, when we swallow a pill, in a sense, we are swallowing a whole techno power apparatus that actually unfolds within the subject, constituting what we think is nature. Right? So this is one level. The other level, of course, is pornography, which is with the old cable communications in the 40s and 50s, you're going to have the invention of a planetary technology of assisted masturbation. This is, if you look at it from the point of view of the 19th century medicine, I think that physicians of the 19th century would have had a heart attack. Because all the idea of the 19th century normalization of heterosexuality was precisely that sexuality leads to reproduction, not to masturbation. Masturbation was thought as a pathology. When we come into this new regime that I call pharmacopornographic, what we have is that masturbation has become part of the devices of capital production within this new regime, and is at the same time producing capital and producing a new subjectivity. So I think that it's completely impossible, for instance, to understand modern masculinity, contemporary masculinity after the 1940s without pornography, without what pornography has done to the invention and recreation of masculinity. And that is what I did when studying Playboy, basically. I had no connection to Playboy, was not a reader of Playboy, as you can imagine. But suddenly I found myself like extremely interested in the period of the 40s and 50s. And I thought like, well, like with the pill, what are the other technologies that are like, blooming there? And one of them, amazingly, is Playboy. And to come back to the shot, because I agree totally with you that this has to do a lot with the shot. And of course, with also with war technologies, you know, maybe you don't know, but I think it's important that we know collectively that pornography was invented as a kind of global technique with the Second World War, as a technique of technical sexual assistance. This is the language of the US Army, sexually, technically assisting the troops that are going to war, right? So let's give them pornography so they can go to war and at the same time get off a little bit without, you know, especially they get into many diseases and whatever. I mean, they rape a little bit is good, but not too much, and they have pornography. And when, I mean, I'm making fun of something that is extremely complex and terrible, but I'm just now replicating in a kind of a joking way what is the discourse of the US Army in the 1950s. And when they come back home, what is going to happen is that those soldiers that have been shaped by pornography, they will come back home and say, okay, we did the job, we want our pornography. And how is this going to happen? I mean, who will give them the pornography that they need? Playboy. That's all the invention, right? And then Playboy will become the biggest magazine in the US, which is the most Puritan conservative country that you can imagine, is what is happening there, right? So this is what I tried to kind of study in pornography. So maybe you, like that, you also see the link between some of the works that I do, in the sense that it's not like suddenly I'm like, oh, I'm going to do a book on Playboy, you know? It's like, no, never. I had never the intention of doing a book on Playboy. But I was like so interested in the 50s and in the transformation of this regime of production of sexuality that was happening in the 50s, that I went into looking many things in the 50s, and I've done a lot of different researches that have not become books as well, but that belong to the ordinary research that I do for writing new things. And I think I should shut up at some point. Let's maybe take a couple questions, or I don't know if you really want to ask questions or say something collectively. I mean, what I always say when I'm in a place like this and you many people here, is that there is a reason why you're here, and it's not just me. You know, it's like, and the important thing is that you are here and that you are together. And that this can happen, this you being together here doing something can happen also when I'm not here. And in the sense that you are like a kind of a constituting assembly of something, right? So that's the power that I see when I look at you, even if I don't see you now, but ideally. Yes.
All right. Okay, there is a microphone here, so over there. Yeah, please come closer.
Come to the light, because otherwise...
why don't you come here, okay? It's intimidating.
Yeah, hi. So I have a question about the experimentation with testosterone. So you say that you had the freedom to experiment, but so I'm a trans non-binary person, and I didn't want to submit to the system. I wanted to experiment, but I had to fall into the pathologizing system. So once you have to fall into the system and you have to submit to the pathologization, and you have to basically give up all of your rights to access tea, how do you stay radical, and how do you apply all of the critical perspective on like the pharmacological industry and all of it, and the system of power that is involved in, you know, taking tea?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think that the same question could be asked in relation to many other things, many other technologies. So I would say that for me there are no positions of purity. There is not an outside, a total outside to the system from which you would be able to fight the system, right? And I'm not saying this as basically like a kind of a high, let's say, middle conservative position and saying, no, you have to be in the system, and there are, no, it's basically what I'm saying this is in relation also to this binary idea that either you are inside and with us, or without us or against us, or you're outside and you're like, you have this pure position. So, in a sense, since from the beginning, from the very moment you start taking testosterone, you are already entangled with the pharmacological industry. You are already entangled with the discourse on transsexuality. There is no outside to that. Even if you relinquish testosterone and you don't take it, you are already within a gender epistemology, right? I mean, there is no matter how radical you are, you can be like non-gender binary and say like fully I do not identify with this regime. Nevertheless, you cannot say like, oh, I'm going to go to a place that is fully non-binary. That place doesn't exist yet completely. There are places, for instance, I agree with you, maybe you have this experience. I have spent most of my life in a very queer trans environment. So up to the point that sometimes I was going out and I was like, oh my God, the binaries still exist, it's still outside, right? But yeah, so for me, it's neither a pure or impure position, like saying, oh, I'm super radical, and I have to give up my radicality now to be able to have, for instance, your passport. I give you my own example. At the beginning, it was not my idea to fully transition, let's say fully, whatever that means. It's ridiculous, but whatever. From female to male. Nevertheless, I found myself traveling a lot because of working with a lot of artists all around the world and whatever, and not being able to travel anymore and not being able to go into a hotel, to rent a car, to use my credit card, nothing that is, everything that is related to the functioning of the capitalist system has to do and is fully embedded within the gender binary epistemology and regime. So if you go outside of it, it's extremely difficult. I mean, when I say if you go outside of it, meaning like, for instance, I had a passport at a certain point that was a female passport, and I could not travel anymore because the person that was at the frontier would tell me, excuse me, sir, this is not just your passport. To which I had to say, indeed, it is, and it's not my passport, right? And then you have to go into a kind of conceptual discussion with the person that is at the border, but depending on, and a kind of a queer class in 2 minutes. But the problem is that depending the border that you are crossing, is complicated. So for instance, I was going, at a certain point, I was living in Athens, I'm going to Beirut very often to work there with the artists. And in order for me to go to Beirut, I will go through a quick refeminization of myself, you know? And why not? Yes, I mean, I'm not going to deal with the whole frontier explaining gender queer theory. No, I just had a foulard and just like a shave, and that's, I mean, I don't know, I insist, my question is not how to be trans, a good trans and more trans. My question is how to be free. That is my question. So, and then is what are the collective prostheses, and I'm going to use that term intentionally since we've been speaking about technologies and appeal. Like for me, the passport is an institutional prosthesis that we need in order for us to be able to cross frontiers. That's why it cannot be denied to people that are coming from Syria, that are coming from Africa. That has to be given. Because denying passport is not just a paper. Denying passport is really killing. It's an eco-political technique. It's condemning to death, basically, right? So at a certain point, I realized myself that I needed to have a passport, and I went into the process of asking the government in Spain, which is a monarchy. I'm not going to get into that. No, what I'm saying this is basically because, and that's why I am a feminist, but I am a trans feminist, and I am other things as well, not just a feminist and a trans feminist, because the power regime that we live in has many different layers, some of which belong, are very contemporary, but some of which are very archaic, come from other times, from other configurations of power. Up to the point, for instance, I mean, imagine monarchy. Imagine, for instance, the alliance of now, today, that's why I call Baroque techno-patriarchy. I imagine the alliance between religion and the technological, pharmacological industry to promote reproduction of heterosexual families. I mean, so we have to start like looking at this complex system, because otherwise we might be fighting the wrong enemy all the time, right? And the question, because I now find this discussion very much within the trans groups and within the queer and feminist groups and so on, basically the whole criticism between us, like, are you trans enough, you're not so trans, you're binary, you're too binary, you're not binary, I said that you were not binary, but then you have a passport, and it's like, what are we talking about here, right? What is the question? It's like, are we surveilling the technologies that we are collectively using in order to be alive and to be able to survive? Or are we going to be thinking about inventing new technologies that would allow for a majority of people, which is not the case now, right? So a redistribution of the technologies of life for us. So this is really crucial, because it's not so much the question of they're like good trans that are really trans, that have passports, take hormones, and they're fully trans, and they identify as men. Then they're like the non-binary, who are super non-binary, and they have to be non-binary all the time, 24 hours a day. And if they, one day, they're binary, like, out of the group. I'm not interested in that. My only interest is how can we invent practices of freedom collectively? And how can we start like thinking collectively about a new epistemology that might not be non-binary, right? But this question is not enough. This question for me is also the question of thinking about a single citizenship for the planet, which is the living body. The living body. Neither nationality, nor religion, no gender, no race differences. And of course, like this idea that someone that is coming from another nation cannot come into this space with me. I think that this is certainly an obsolete regime that is coming too much indeed and still from the 19th century, and that we have to fight again. And we cannot fight the non-binary, the binary system, while at the same time, for instance, being on the side of the state when we are claiming, for instance, the right to take testosterone within a protocol. Do you understand what I'm saying, right? So the question of criticality and the question of the activist techniques, I think it has to be an experimental question and a question of creativity. That's why, for me, art and poetics are so crucial, because it's not a question of morals. It's not a question of being a good trans. It's a question of inventing freedom collectively, right? And for that, I don't have, like, I cannot tell you, like, how this can be done. This has to be invented constantly.
One last question, or one last question?
I think no, you're called.
Yeah.
Yes. So let's take one question because we're flexible.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi. I wanted to ask you about just your concept of being a good trans, being a good non-binary, being good at performing or, let's say, representing your identity, and how identity seems to me to be connected to institutions. That is, say you have given an example of how when you wanted to become trans, you would have to go through the system, you would have to register, etc., etc. And every way that you would want to seek freedom, in essence, to me, seems institutionalized. The deconstruction of the binary, in some ways, seems to be tied to institutional processes, to collective processes, etc., as it was the story with the passport. So, to me, freedom, which should be sought more so than identity, I mean identity in the sense that, yeah, okay. Freedom seems not to be in this, let's say, in this discourse at all. It seems to be more about identity and institution and performing identity within the institution, rather than considering freedom within the discourse. So what would you, am I interpreting this correctly, or what would you say would be the way to get to freedom, which seems to be outside of this binary?
Well, of course, it's a very, thank you for the question, it's a very interesting, complex as well, and we have little time, so it's impossible that I think. But this question of freedom, that by the way is also very Foucauldian, I think that I'm saying that it's very Foucauldian because among other people, also for instance Spinoza, Deleuze and Guattari are also working on this direction, but Foucault is speaking about freedom as a practice, not meaning it's not that you are free and then you have to ask the state to recognize your freedom, right? No. Freedom doesn't exist as something that is already there. Freedom has to be constructed. Freedom is a practice. Freedom is something that has to be collectively done. And therefore it's not like, oh, I want to be free and individually free and let me alone. No, the question is how to collectively invent practices of freedom. So you realize that whenever I've been speaking about freedom, I always speak about these practices, right? Which is kind of crucial to me. And I think that maybe the question is that, especially if you are young, what has happened in the last, since the 70s, since the neoliberal term, we have completely substituted the notion of freedom by the notion of free market. And this was very, I think this became evident to me because I was born in Spain, which was a fascist country for more than 50 years, and we transitioned into, let's say, democracy in the late 70s, early 80s, right? And what happened in Spain, for instance, is that we went from fascism into the free market, and they called this free market democracy. But we had no freedom. There was no freedom in the deal. It was just like from fascism into, and in Italy, by the way, you have someone that is extraordinary, very sophisticated reader of this transition, which is Pasolini. Pasolini is someone that is extremely acute when understanding that what is happening through the 70s and the 60s even is the shifting between fascism into the neoliberal market, and freedom has disappeared. It will be the free market. So what I'm trying to do, and within our sexual minority movements, but in other movements as well, is that we have to reappropriate the language of freedom. This cannot continue. This is it. It's not possible. And the only language of freedom that we have is the language of the market. This is enough. So we need to start creating a whole new grammar for freedom. And that is not metaphysical freedom, I insist, It is not freedom, the Messiah that will come. It is not freedom that is inside of us and that we have to fight to rebuild. And that's why these logics of the coming out are a little bit stupid as well, in the sense of, well, let me tell you my truth and the whole thing. But what is freedom to be collectively constructed? And freedom as experimentation. Freedom as something new. In the sense, new, of course, when I say new, again, the problem is the market, and new as something that it will be consumed and so on. When I speak about new, I'm speaking about what in philosophy we call eventful, event. Something that happens, that modifies what was there before. And therefore, I cannot imagine, for instance, the transformation of the epistemology of the gender binary without thinking about the notion of freedom and without freedom. Because opening up the gender binary is not just to have a third sex. That's the issue. It's not to have an administration, an institutional administration of a third sex, it's not like male, female, and something else. No, it's really to affirm the radical impossibility for the living being to be reduced to the potential of reproduction. Because that's exactly what the gender binary is now. Basically, considering each of the bodies as either potentially a sperm producer or a reproductive uterus, right? So if we go beyond that and we take the complexity of living being as radically irreducible to not just the binary, but to any category, right? Like taking fully out the notion of sex as a notion that we define the conditions of life within society. So, and I don't think this can be done without the notion of freedom. I think it's impossible. We can do it with identity, as it's been done until now, and the conclusion is the LGBTQ movement, right? The conclusion is still a stronger segmentation of the movement and the detachment of this movement from its radical revolutionary demands, right? But I don't think that we can do the transformation, the full transformation of this epistemology without freedom and without the notion of freedom. I think we have to stop because we're freezing.
Okay. Well, thank you to Paul Preciado again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to everybody who made this event possible. Faculty support, front office, maintenance, media lab, com department, the students, Iago Montinori, Preciado. Yeah, and the books are over there. Thank you.